It was the early hours of April 30th, 1943. The Atlantic Ocean off the coast of Spain was pitch black, the water cold and unforgiving. Breaking the surface, the British submarine HMS Seraph rose just enough to expose its conning tower. The crew moved in silence. They weren't launching a torpedo. They weren't landing commandos. They were hauling a heavy steel canister onto the deck. Inside was the most important weapon the Allies possessed at that moment. It wasn't a bomb. It was a corpse. They opened the canister. The body of a man, dressed in the uniform of a Royal Marines major, slid onto the wet steel of the deck. A Mae West life jacket was strapped to his chest. A briefcase was chained to his wrist. The captain, Bill Jewell, read a brief prayer, Psalm 39. "I will keep my mouth with a bridle, while the wicked is before me." Then, gently, they pushed the body into the swirling dark water. The submarine's wash caught him, pushing him toward the shore. The crew vanished back inside, the hatch clanged shut, and the Seraph dove. As the submarine disappeared, the dead man was left alone, bobbing in the waves. He carried no pulse, no breath, and no future. But in his pockets, and in that briefcase, he carried the fate of the entire Second World War. This is the story of Operation Mincemeat. The moment British intelligence decided that the only way to save thousands of living soldiers was to employ one dead man. To understand the sheer insanity of this plan, you have to look at the map of Europe in 1943. The continent was a fortress. Nazi Germany controlled everything from the French coast to the Russian front. The Allies, fresh from victory in North Africa, were gathered in Tunisia, looking across the Mediterranean. The next step was obvious. It was glaringly, painfully obvious. Sicily. The island of Sicily sits like a stepping stone between Africa and Italy. It was the key to the soft underbelly of Europe. Winston Churchill knew it, the American generals knew it, and, most critically, Adolf Hitler knew it. As Churchill famously said, anyone but a bloody fool would know it was Sicily. The Germans were already fortifying the island, pouring in troops, tanks, and aircraft. If the Allies landed there as expected, it wouldn't be an invasion. It would be a slaughter. An amphibious assault against a prepared enemy is the hardest military maneuver in existence. The beaches would run red. British intelligence faced an impossible paradox. They had to invade Sicily, but they had to convince the German High Command that they were invading anywhere else. They needed a lie so convincing, so detailed, and so robust that Hitler would overrule his own generals and move his armies away from the real target. The idea came from the murky depths of the 20 Committee, the double-cross system run by MI5. Two men sat at the center of it. Ewan Montague, a brilliant naval intelligence officer with a sharp, calculating mind, and Charles Cholmondeley, an eccentric flight lieutenant with a flair for the dramatic. They recalled a memo from years prior, the Trout Memo, which suggested planting misleading papers on a corpse found at sea. It sounded like fiction. In fact, the memo was inspired by a young Ian Fleming, the future creator of James Bond. But in 1943, fiction was the only resource they had left. The plan was simple in theory, agonizing in execution. They would drop a body off the coast of Spain, a country technically neutral but teeming with German spies. The body would wash ashore, appearing to be the victim of a plane crash at sea. The Spanish authorities would find the documents on him and, adhering to protocol, would hand them back to the British, but not before showing them to the Germans. First, they needed a body. This was the most delicate and gruesome part of the operation. They couldn't just use any casualty. The body had to look like it had drowned or died of hypothermia and exposure. They found their man in a London morgue, Glyndwr Michael. He wasn't a soldier. He wasn't a hero. He was a homeless man from Wales, a tragic figure who had drifted through life, struggling with poverty and mental health issues. He had died after ingesting rat poison, which contains phosphorus. The chemical reaction in his body mimicked the signs of death by exposure at sea. Montague and Cholmondeley claimed the body. They promised that while Glyndwr Michael had lived a sad, obscure life, he would do something magnificent in death. They began the process of transforming him. Glyndwr Michael ceased to exist. In his place, they created Major William Martin of the Royal Marines. This was not just about putting a uniform on a corpse. German intelligence, the Abwehr, was thorough. If they sensed a trap, the game was over. The British officers had to create a soul for Major Martin. They gave him a personality. In his pockets, they placed the debris of a real life: keys, a box of matches, a receipt for a diamond engagement ring, a furious letter from his bank about an overdraft, because a real soldier is always short on cash. They went further. They created a fiancée for him. They named her Pam. A female clerk at MI5 posed for a photograph, smiling on a sunny day. They put the photo in his wallet. They wrote love letters from Pam to William, actual handwritten letters that were folded and unfolded to look read. The letters spoke of wedding plans and mundane worries. They made Major Martin a man in love, a man with a future, a man who had everything to live for. This psychological detail was the bait. It made the Germans feel like they were invading a man's privacy, not analyzing a plant. It made him real. Then came the MacGuffin. The reason for Major Martin to be flying: a single briefcase chained to his wrist. Inside was a letter marked personal and most secret. It was written by Lieutenant General Archibald Nye, Vice Chief of the Imperial General Staff, addressed to General Alexander in Tunisia. The letter was a masterpiece of deception. It casually discussed Allied plans. It joked about sardines, a subtle hint at Sardinia. It explicitly stated that the target was Greece. It suggested that Sicily was merely a diversion to draw German troops away from the Balkans. The brilliance of the letter was that it didn't try to sell the lie too hard. It treated the invasion of Greece as a settled fact, something the generals were already working on. It was chatty. It was informal. It was exactly the kind of letter a high-ranking officer would entrust to a courier, rather than send over encrypted radio channels. Once the stage was set, the HMS Seraph delivered the lead actor to the theater. On that dark morning in April, Major Martin began his drift toward the Spanish fishing town of Huelva. The body was discovered by a sardine fisherman named José Antonio Rey Maria. He hauled the sodden mass aboard and brought it to port. The Spanish authorities took custody. The British vice-consul in Huelva, who was in on the plot, acted perfectly. He began frantically demanding the return of the body and, more importantly, the briefcase. He acted nervous. He acted desperate. He sent encrypted cables back to London saying, "Briefcase suspected compromised," knowing full well the Germans were breaking his codes. The more the British panicked, the more interested the Germans became. Huelva was a nest of spies. The German key man there was Adolf Klaus. an efficient and well-connected Abwehr agent. He heard the rumors of the British officer and the briefcase. He activated his network. He pressured the Spanish military governor. He needed to see those documents. For days, the briefcase sat in a Spanish safe. The British held their breath. If the Spanish just returned it unopened, the operation was a failure. They needed the seal to be broken. Finally, under immense German pressure, the Spanish relented. In a secret room in Madrid, the briefcase was opened. The Germans were allowed to photograph the letters. They carefully extracted the paper, drying it out to read the ink, then rehydrating it to fold it back exactly as it was. They thought they were being surgical. But British intelligence had analyzed the process. They had placed a single eyelash in the fold of one of the letters. When the briefcase was eventually returned to London, the eyelash was missing. The British knew. The Germans had swallowed the bait. The intelligence traveled up the Nazi chain of command with terrifying speed. The photographs landed on the desk of Karl Dönitz, and eventually on the desk of Adolf Hitler. The Führer read the letters. He looked at the personal effects. He saw the logic. Greece, the Balkans. It made sense to him. He had always feared an attack in the Balkans, which would cut off Germany's supply of raw materials. The documents confirmed his own biases. The order went out. Mincemeat had succeeded beyond Montagu's wildest dreams. Hitler overruled Mussolini. He overruled his own field marshals who still suspected Sicily. He ordered a massive redeployment. A panzer division was moved all the way from France to Greece. A journey of hundreds of miles across partisan-infested territory. Tanks, artillery, and aircraft were stripped from the Italian front and sent to Sardinia and the Balkans. They sent torpedo boats to the Greek coast. They laid minefields off the wrong beaches. In Sicily, the defenses were left dangerously thin. The troops that remained were distracted, looking over their shoulders, waiting for an order to move to Greece that would never come. On the night of July 9, 1943, the wind howled across the Mediterranean. A massive Allied armada, the largest amphibious force in history up to that point, larger even than the D-Day fleet, approached the coast of Sicily. Operation Husky had begun. The German and Italian defenders were caught completely off balance. They were looking east, toward Greece. When the first waves of American, British, and Canadian troops hit the Sicilian beaches, they expected a wall of fire. Instead, in many sectors, they faced disorganized resistance. The crushing slaughter that everyone had predicted did not happen. The Allies secured the beachheads. They moved inland. Casualties were heavy. War is always bloody. But they were a fraction of the projected estimates. Thousands of young men who were statistically destined to die that morning walked off the beaches alive. In Berlin, the confusion was total. Even as the Allies stormed Sicily, Hitler remained convinced it was a feint. He refused to send reinforcements for critical days, believing the real blow was still about to fall on Greece. By the time the German high command realized the truth, it was too late. Sicily had fallen. The road to Rome was open. Mussolini's regime began to crumble. Back in London, a simple message was sent to Winston Churchill, who was in Washington, D.C. It read, "Mincemeat swallowed rod, line, and sinker." The deception was a masterpiece of tradecraft, but its core was human. It relied on the tragic anonymity of a homeless man. For decades, the body in the grave in Huelva was known only as William Martin. It wasn't until the late 1990s that the British government finally declassified the true identity of the corpse. Today, if you go to the cemetery in Huelva, Spain, you will find a tombstone. It lists the name Major William Martin. But added to the stone is a postscript acknowledging the man beneath the uniform, Glyndwr Michael. He had lived a life of quiet desperation, ignored by society, alone in a cold city. But in death, he played the lead role in the war's greatest drama. He fooled the entire Nazi war machine. Operation Mincemeat remains a testament to the power of imagination in warfare. It proved that battles are not just won with tanks and artillery, but with psychology, detail, and the audacity to do the impossible. It serves as a chilling reminder of the value of information and how easily perception can be manipulated. But ultimately, it is a story about the debt the living owe to the dead. The soldiers who stormed the beaches of Sicily, who went on to liberate Europe, who returned home to raise families and build the future, they walked on a path cleared by a man who never really existed, and a man who had died unnoticed in a warehouse in London. Glyndwr Michael served as a soldier in a war he never saw, saving an army he never knew.